If you love Review Mirror Chronicles podcast and you want to help us keep bringing you the most brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Houghton, and I have to say I'm super excited to be doing the third and final episode of Cochrane. It's the summer of 1808. The Napoleonic Wars are raging. France has invaded Spain and occupied many of its cities and key military installations, but the Spanish people are fighting back with a fierce determination. In their struggle against French occupation, they are supported by a British army operating on the Iberian Peninsula. And Britain's Royal Navy is harassing any French-controlled piece of the European coast. In one of the most celebrated naval actions of its age, in the Shelton Bay off the Basque Roads on the Biscay coast, a group of British ships has driven an entire French squadron ashore. Battleships are resting on their sides, stuck in the mud and the sand, as their crews desperately try to lighten them, because they can be refloated at the next high tide. The assault was led by Thomas Lord Cochrane. He had commanded the attack from the deck of a floating bomb, an explosion ship filled with shells, casks of gunpowder and hand grenades, all detonated by a fuse laid and lit by him and his crew, which gave them only a few moments to jump overboard and row to safety. Those explosive ships were then followed by 20 fire ships, flaming spectres in the moonless night that drifted slowly towards the French to disorientate, to sow confusion and perhaps just burn enemy vessels. The attack is a success, but only thanks to Cochrane's leadership. His overall commander, the superior officer, Admiral Gambier, refused to follow up his success. He held back his bigger battleships in deeper water, rather than allowing them to close with the stranded enemy and smash them to matchwood. Infuriated, Cochrane takes matters into his own hands and sailed his little frigate, his much smaller ship, the HMS Imperius, right up close to the stranded French ships to blast them himself, forcing Admiral Gambier, shaming him to send in bigger ships in his wake. After the Battle of Basque Roads, Cochrane knows that if he hadn't taken the lead in that way, if he hadn't taken decisive action, the endeavour would have fallen far short of the expectations of their lordship at the Admiralty back in London. And Cochrane returned to Britain determined that the rest of the world should know this as well. He's about to make some very powerful enemies who will ensure that his life, his reputation, and his fortune are dealt a near-lethal blow. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the final episode in my series on Thomas Lord Cochrane, the real master and commander, dubbed by Napoleon the Sea Wolf. And in this episode, we'll be hearing about Cochrane's tragic fall from national treasure to national disgrace. And his story, believe it or not, will get even more astonishing. So get ready, folks. Sit back and enjoy. Captain Thomas Lord Cochrane returned to Britain carrying news of this remarkable victory. But Britain's armies were struggling on the continent. Napoleon appeared dominant. So, news that nearly an entire squadron of Napoleon's fleet had been burnt, scattered, driven up on the shore, neutralized in the jaws of the Basque Roads was celebrated with gusto by a nation really in need of victories. No one doubted that Cochrane was the hero. He appeared in popular ballads. He was the toast of London. He was made a Knight of the Order of the Bath. And if you're not familiar with that, it's an honour of chivalry seldom awarded to lowly frigate captains. But here he was. There were only 36 of these illustrious knights in the United Kingdom at any one time, and Cochrane was now among that elite. But as the immediate celebrations died down just a little, questions started to be raised. The Times newspaper pondered if the whole French squadron had ended up on their sides, on their beam ends, on the rocks, on the mudflats. Why had only 4 of them ended up being completely destroyed? William Wordsworth, not one to step back from the fray, He asked whether the excessive caution demonstrated by Lord Gambier's fleet in effect amounted to cowardice. This was unheard of. So did Cochrane enjoy his new celebrity? He did quietly, in a dignified fashion. But did he actually rise above the fray? Did he revel in the praise and let others draw their own conclusions when they read the reports about Admiral Gambier? Well, he should have, but of course, that wasn't Cochrane's way. He actually took those questions, those whispers, as a slight on his own effectiveness, on his own bravery, and the decisions that he had made. And he effectively wanted the world to know that any mistakes that had been made in following up his success had been no fault of his own. He wanted the world to know that Admiral Gambier had screwed up. I spoke to Cochrane's biographer, David Cordingley, whose book, Cochrane the Dauntless, was the inspiration for this three-part series. And his book is as brilliantly written as it is meticulously researched. I have to say, if you want more detail on what took place, please buy it. And when I talked to him, he summarized what had happened next. He said that if Cochrane had left things as they were, all would have been well. But Cochrane being Cochrane, he's furious that Gambier had not sent in the British fleet to destroy the entire French fleet when they were aground. So he stands up in Parliament and he refuses to support a vote of thanks to Gambier. Gambier is incredibly upset about this because it's a slight on his character, and he demands to have a court-martial because he has now been slighted. Gambier, Cochrane, and the Committee of Admirals that would decide their fate met in the great stern cabin of the battleship HMS Gladiator, and everyone knew they were in an arena. And of course, the panel was made up of Gambier's friends and colleagues. A strange assortment of admirals who Cochrane at various times of his career had snubbed or been rude to or disobeyed. The events of the Battle of Basque Roads were picked apart forensically, and Cochrane was savagely cross-examined. He was caught off guard, he was tripped up with legal niceties, and the captains who'd been there at the battle with him came in to give their evidence. And funnily enough, when they found themselves in front of a board of admirals in whose hands their future careers lay, they toned down their criticisms of Admiral Gambier. Not surprisingly, the court found in favour of Gambier. He was handed back his sword, and he was told that he had shown zeal, good judgment, and great ability. The establishment had effectively closed ranks. They'd protected one of their own. They'd protected an admiral against a maverick, an upstart frigate captain. Cochrane never knew when he'd been beaten. That's what actually made him so great with a deck beneath his feet. But in the corridors of power in London, perhaps it was a disadvantage. So he then decided to take his fight to Parliament. Don't forget, he was an MP, and he set up a most magnificent speech criticising Gambier. But again, the establishment closed ranks. He endured a bruising debate and then lost the vote. And these fights in Parliament pushed him towards a group of people that perhaps weren't his natural allies by birth, but became his fellow travellers on this journey. They were radicals. These were men who wanted root and branch reform. They wanted constitutional change, an upheaval in who could vote in Britain and how they could vote. They wanted to reform constituencies so that new cities like Manchester could actually receive their own representation, instead of being represented from the south in London. Cochrane shared with these radicals a sense that he'd been excluded, done over by the existing establishment. And it wasn't just the fact that he felt aggrieved. He believed in the causes that he espoused. He believed that Gambier had shown insufficient zeal in the face of the enemy. He tried to expose corruption in the Admiralty, and there was certainly plenty of it. He then spoke out against ridiculously generous pensions to so-called office holders, friends of the high and mighty, far more than what combat veterans received. As an example, very quietly, one member of a noble family had some advice for him. He suggested that adherence to the pursuits of his profession, of which he is so great an ornament, will tend more to his honour and to the advantage of his country than his perseverance in the conduct which he has of late adopted. Conduct which can only lead him into error and make him the dupe of those who use the authority of his name to advance their own mischievous purposes. What we see here is the oligarchy that effectively ruled over George and Britain. They were warning one of their own. They were warning Lord Cochrane to hold his tongue, to mind the company he kept. Otherwise, he would face exclusion. Cochrane, well, he ignored this advice. He picked fights seemingly with everyone he could. And he even at this point sails into Malta to argue his case before a court that was deciding how much prize money he was owed. He ended up getting arrested on that particular expedition, though naturally he hacked through the bars and escaped. It's so very Cochrane. Tangentially, while he was on that trip, I should say, in a rather disturbing episode, he visited Sicily. He went to a sulfur mine and he witnessed a group of people accidentally killed when sulfur caught on fire and produced a cloud of sulfur dioxide. And as a result of that, he dropped detailed plans for sulfur dioxide's use on the battlefield as an early form of chemical warfare. You'll remember from episode 1, his father was a crazy inventor, and Cochrane had definitely inherited his fascination with chemistry and physics and engineering. And if you remember from episode 2, he in fact studied it at Edinburgh University. He came home from that very odd trip and then continued his pursuit of justice. He rallied against the low pay of sailors. He spoke up, quite rightly, for French prisoners of war that were being held in a prison on Dartmoor. He made absolutely no effort to lobby or to smooze. And perhaps he actually needed to learn that roaring about something in Parliament is actually very difficult to working through committees and people who could bring about change that he desperately wanted. He effectively became regarded as a subversive, as a radical, as a class traitor, as a troublemaker. And when he presented an idea to the Prince Regent for using poison gas and rockets to attack the French naval base at Brest, it went absolutely nowhere. It was quietly shelved. He was becoming a pariah. During this turbulent period of time, he decided to get married. He was 36, and his bride was Kate Corbin Barnes. Sometimes he called her his little mouse in his letters. And obviously, being Cochrane, the marriage was extremely complicated. Cochrane's uncle, an incredibly wealthy man, wanted to restore the fortunes of the family and offered to leave Cochrane a lot of money to re-establish himself in Scotland if he married a certain wealthy heiress. Well, Cochrane didn't want to marry that heiress, Catherine Maria Bannerman, the daughter of Sir Alexander Bannerman, so instead he elopes to Gretna Green and marries Kate instead, who was not wealthy, but whom he loved unashamedly, but of course thereby infuriating his uncle. In 1814, his enemies seized the opportunity they'd been looking for to utterly destroy him. Cochrane's youngest uncle was a dubious character. He was a scoundrel. He was the slave-trading governor of Dominica, and he maintained a large harem while he was in that position. He was hounded out of every job he did for egregious corruption, which is actually pretty bloody difficult in Georgian Britain. And he had an even more dubious companion, and by 1814 they'd come up with a scheme to make a lot of money. His friend pretended to land in Dover, bringing news from the continent that Napoleon had been killed by Russian Cossacks. He then travelled to London, spreading the rumour everywhere he went. A coach was then seen galloping through the city of London, apparently with French émigrés, French exiles, waving French flags, shouting, "Long live the king, Napoleon is dead." With all these rumours swirling and all these strange sights, the London stock market rose rapidly. Government stock rose by nearly 20%, and it then fell back a few days later when no confirmation from the continent arrived. This strange spike then triggered a stock market investigation, one of the first of its kind, and it was found that 6 people had made a lot of money in that brief window when the market rose. And of course, one of them was Cochrane's uncle. The other 3 were 3 dodgy blokes who'd been posing as Frenchmen on the carriage. And the last person was Thomas Cochrane himself. His uncle had definitely been behind the ruse, no question about it. And his uncle had actually been staying with him in his house when all this had happened. And of course, the dodgy friend who'd bought the fake news, of Napoleon's death had been observed arriving at Cochrane's house on numerous occasions, obviously to continue the the ruse with his uncle. And of course, Cochrane had actually made lots of money on the surging market, and it was pretty damning and circumstantial evidence. The Lords of the Admiralty were watching closely. This was a man that had opposed them. So before the trial takes place, before Cochrane is called to trial, he was suddenly replaced as captain of the new battleship HMS Tonnant, in which he'd been due to head to America to try and sort out the less than stellar British efforts in the War of 1812 that had broken out with the Americans. It was also at this time that Cochrane's first baby was born. He was born amidst the scandal, and with the baby only 2 days old, Cochrane was formally charged with unlawfully conspiring to spread false news and occasion a rise in the prices of government funds. Cochrane again mishandled the legal process. He missed the opportunity to establish a separate defense, so he was actually going to be tried alongside his uncle and his dodgy friends, all together in one joint enterprise. Now, given that most of the others were absolutely as guilty as hell, this was a huge problem for him and the Admiralty. The judge, Lord Ellenborough, was a high Tory, a deeply conservative man, a deeply religious man, and he hated with a passion radical politicians. And there were other people involved throughout the process with links to other enemies that Cochrane had made along the way. So the trial was effectively a farce. The jury returned in record time its verdict. All defendants were guilty. Cochrane then wrote, "All my fortitude is required to bear up against this unfortunate and unmerited stroke." He launched an appeal with fresh evidence on his innocence, but it was ruled as inadmissible because 2 of the guilty men had bolted out of the country and as a result of the trial. So Cochrane was effectively left holding the can. He was sentenced to a year in prison. And more humiliatingly than that, he was ordered to endure a session standing in the pillory, basically the stocks, for an hour outside the Royal Exchange. This was unheard of, certainly for a peer of the realm. When the sentence was given, the colour drained from his face. He stood expressionless, stupefied. He had to be helped out of the courtroom. He was then taken immediately to the King's Bench prison on Borough High Street. It had a relatively comfortable lodging in those days. Rich people could actually secure themselves a slightly nicer accommodation in prisons. But of course you had to pay. But his enemies had even worse in store for Cochrane. While he was locked up, the Prince Regent was persuaded to strip him of his naval rank. This was called degradation. He would also be removed from the Navy list, and he would lose all seniority. No longer a captain, no longer a naval officer. His career effectively expunged. The Prince Regent then declared, "I will never permit a service hitherto of unblemished honour to be disgraced by the continuance of Lord Cochrane. I shall also strip him of the Order of the Bath." In August, there was a ritual at midnight in Westminster Abbey. The so-called Bath King of Arms took down Cochrane's standard from its niche in the Henry VII Chapel, where the standards of the most honourable knights of the Order of the Bath remain to this day. Cochrane was no longer in the Navy. He was released from prison to speak for himself in a parliamentary debate in which they were deciding whether to expel him from Parliament. The official record is littered with asterisks. He made foul-mouthed attacks on Lord Ellenborough, the judge, always charging harder at his enemies. Sometimes not the smartest strategy. The motion to throw him out of the House of Commons passed 144 to 44 votes. A close friend of his reports that he wept. But even in this darkest hour, there were glimmers of hope. The electors of Westminster, the people that had put him in Parliament in the first place, were not going to be told by anyone who was allowed to represent them. And when there was a by-election, they immediately returned Cochrane to his post. He ran unopposed. And it was a brave man who stood against Lord Cochrane that summer. In the same way, the government faced a huge problem over Cochrane going in the pillory for an hour. They knew that His Majesty's sailors and many of the people of London were not going to stand by and watch a national treasure, a national hero, humiliated as others sought to pelt him with muck. And the government certainly didn't want a riot of furious tars charging through the town in rage by the degradation of one of the most celebrated and beloved commanders of all time. So the government announced that, by coincidence, they'd chosen that opportunity to commute anyone who'd been sentenced to stand in the pillory. And of course, that would include Lord Cochrane. So that was at least one final humiliation that he didn't have to face. But in every other way, his life was basically over. He'd lost his job, he'd lost his income, he'd lost his status as a crusading parliamentarian. He'd lost his honor, he's lost his reputation, he'd effectively lost his future, and he was languishing in prison. He wrote to his wife that he didn't want her there, that this is not a place favorable to morality. And he said, "I wish you to remain as uncorrupted as you are by the wickedness of the world." I mean, it must have been absolutely unbearable for him. And in fact, he refused to bear it. He was never going to stay put in there if he could help it. He escaped from prison. Of course he did. He used rope to get over the wall, but then one of them snapped and he fell 20 feet and knocked himself out. Once revived, he made for his house in Hampshire, where he spent a lovely fortnight with his wife and his son, while a nationwide manhunt was launched for him. He then decided to go to London. He strolled into Parliament and demanded to be seated. The warden of the prison was then summoned and tried to overpower him. There was a fight, and he was eventually subdued and dragged back. Having tried to escape, he'd sacrificed his ability for decent lodgings. He was locked up in a dank cell for months. And of course, his health collapsed. And he was actually very lucky to survive. Vast numbers of prisoners in Georgian prisons succumbed to what was called jail fever because the conditions were so horrific. But he did survive, and he was eventually released in June of 1815. And of course, what do you think he then did? He threw himself into picking a fight with the judge who'd sent him down in the first instance. He tried to impeach Lord Ellenborough. And of course, not a single MP would back his cause. And he was soon back in court, of course, because he then had to answer for his escape from prison. The jury found him guilty, but after a spirited defense, the judge decided to let him off with a fine, which Cochrane then, of course, refused to pay. He then received news that his Hampshire house was being repossessed for unpaid bills. He then made another interesting decision of surrounding it with bags of coal, saying that it was gunpowder, and threatened to blow the whole house sky high unless they left him alone. And I have to say that this is probably the lowest possible point of Cochrane's story. He could go no lower. So what we have is our principal character, our hero, as a bankrupt. And he's pretended to blow up his own house rather than lose it. And of course, all of this, the way that he'd been treated by the establishment pushed him even further towards the radicals. And he started attending political meetings in Winchester. He rejected a loyal toast to the Prince Regent, suggesting instead that they drink a toast to the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights, for which his forefathers had fought and bled. At this one particular meeting, a clergyman spat at him, very Christian, and other clergymen jumped on him and started to beat him up. Oddly, this was a man never to shy from a fight, and now he was fighting with a bunch of priests. But then, in this darkest of moments, he was thrown a lifeline. He was thrown a lifeline by a man from Chile. Antonio Varese had come to Britain from a Spanish colony trying to throw off the imperial Spanish yoke. And what he needed was men who could sail and men who could fight. And he had $100,000 with him to sign them up. Cochrane's reputation as a naval fighter had somehow endured, even through everything that he'd gone through. And he was actually offered a job as Commander-in-Chief of Chile's naval forces. And of course he said yes. Alvarez then reported back to the Chilean rebel government that he'd signed up one of the most famous and perhaps the most valiant seamen in Britain, and one who'd fought for liberal principles in the British Parliament. Cochrane then decided to go to that Parliament and give one last speech. He announced it was probably the last time he should ever have the honour of addressing the House on any subject. He explained why he'd supported radical causes, and he predicted that unless those in power agreed to widen the franchise, to share the power, to absorb more of Britain's infant political processes, there would be riots and possibly even revolution. Cochrane was urging the British fleet, a group that he'd been born into, to reform from within, before violent radical reform was imposed on them from without. And on the 15th of August, he set sail for South America, and he would not be seen in Britain for 7 years. After a typical uncomfortable rounding of Cape Horn, the decks awash, scoured by snow flurries, they sailed into the Chilean port of Valparaiso on the 29th of November. South America was in complete turmoil. It had not escaped the revolutionary energy of the late 18th century. The American Republic, the United States of America, was an example that they widely admired. If the American colonials could throw off the British yoke, why could not the Spanish in South America do the same? The opportunity came when Europe was engulfed in chaos following the French Revolution. It was the ideal time to split from Spain. There was no better time. The Spanish were not in a position to restore, to impose, to reinforce Spanish rule, while Spain was fighting an existential battle in their own homeland against the French. In the north of the continent, Simón Bolívar led Bolivia and Colombia to independence. In the south, Uruguay and Argentina broke away. A man called José de San Martin led a force against Argentina over the Andes, trying to liberate Chile. His close comrade was Bernardo O'Higgins. What a wonderful name. He had an Irish father who'd been the Spanish viceroy in Peru, and he'd actually been educated in Britain. And he knew that in South America, the sea was absolutely vital. The interior of that continent is virtually impenetrable, and it's hugely difficult to trade through any of that to establish industry. And he actually came out and he said, after one successful fight with the Spanish on land, that this battle and 100 more will be meaningless unless we control the seas. And of course, these vast expanses of South America were far more easily traversed by ship, along that incredible coastline than by dodgy roads, which were prone to mudslides and then, of course, battered by frequent earthquakes. Commerce and control and Spanish reinforcement relied on movement by ships. And if you controlled that, then you controlled the Pacific. And that's why Cochrane was being called in. And at this stage, we'll take a quick break and a message from our sponsor and be right back.
Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com.
And we're back. So when Cochrane arrives in Chile, the Chileans threw this great party for him, but he actually chafed at the delays. He was here to fight, not feast. O'Higgins wanted to move north from Chile and invade Peru the following year, which was the administrative center of Spanish America, with Lima its capital and Callao, the principal Spanish port, next door to it on the Pacific coast. Cochrane was then shown his fleet. He had 7 little ships, 7 little handy ships. 2/3 of his seamen were Brits or Americans, and on the 16th of January 1819 he set sail. He was back in the business of fighting the Spaniards. Cochrane then sailed north and got to Callao. And he passed ships along the way that he just ignored. So far, so good. He was obeying orders. But then he immediately attempted to seize a Spanish frigate while a carnival was absorbing the attention of the defenders. Typical Cochrane fashion, but the winds failed him at exactly the wrong moment and left him at the mercy of the guns and the fortress on the coast. Hearing that Cochrane was now at sea off the coast, the Spanish commander wrote to him, asking what on earth was he doing there. And Cochrane replied, and I'll quote this verbatim, "A British nobleman is a free man capable of judging between right and wrong and at liberty to adopt a country and a cause which aim at restoring the rights of oppressed human nature." I mean, it's actually a really good retort. He then launched another attack in March with an explosion vessel. his old playbook. This also failed, and he switched to a policy of raiding ships and capturing precious cargo. This proved very lucrative. And of course, he wouldn't only capture ships, he would land ashore. He would seize mule trains, capturing the famous bullion from the silver mines of South America. Their precious cargoes rowed back to fill the hulls of his ships. And of course, he captured enemy ships. He captured and destroyed Spanish forts. And it's notable that from all his kind of highfalutin rhetoric to that Spanish commander that I just read to you about judging between right and wrong and fighting against those who oppress human nature, Cochrane was also very mindful of prize money and restoring his personal financial position. He then headed back to Chile with his prizes and then headed north again in late 1819. Another attack on Callao failed, and again the wind died and the fire ships just stopped dead in the water. The rockets that he fired looked impressive but hit nothing of any value, so he switched targets and headed south. Valdivia was the last Spanish possession in Chile. It's the first port you get to after rounding Cape Horn, right down in the south of Chile. It was a very well-defended, very important Spanish settlement. And of course, they weren't expecting Cochrane. And in true Cochrane style, he sailed straight in, flying a massive Spanish flag. He then took a small boat to make soundings, to effectively measure the depth of the water, and he took a good close look at what the artillery and the forts around the Grand Harbour looked like. When an official came out to check up on them, he immediately took him prisoner, and he proved incredibly talkative. He actually told Cochrane and his men that a supply ship was on the way with stores and the entire garrison's wages. Cochrane then waited and pounced on it when it arrived. $20,000 of Spanish silver was then transferred to his locked boxes. He sailed up the coast to pick up some more Chilean soldiers, and then in late 1820 he launched, I think, what was possibly the riskiest attack of his career. He decided to return to Valdivia and attack it, the strongest Spanish fort in the Americas, defended by no less than 2,000 men in forts with interlocking fields of fire. But while he'd been there, sneaking about, taking sound depths, he'd noticed that the guns primarily pointed out to sea, so he made the logical decision to attack the forts from the land. And at this point, he gives a brilliant summary of his operational approach to war. I want to quote it in detail. What he then said was, to a subordinate, "Cool calculation makes it appear that any attempt to take Valdivia is madness. This is one reason why the Spaniards will hardly believe us in earnest, even when we commence. And you will see that a bold onset with little perseverance afterwards will give a complete triumph. For operations unexpected by the enemy are, when well executed, almost certain to succeed, whatever may be the odds, and success will preserve the enterprise from the imputation of rashness." And really, isn't that just Lord Cochrane in one paragraph? The build-up to the attack did not go smoothly. They managed to hit a reef. Cochrane then had to strip down to his breeches and actually fix the pumps himself because no other man could do it, so the men could actually stem the water coming in through a gash in the hull. A massive gash in the hull, I have to say. They then had to abandon the flagship and to transfer to smaller vessels. But he didn't give up. No. He landed Marines on the shore who went around the fort and stormed it from the landward side. As the defenders bolted, a second fort opened its gates to let the fugitives in, and Cochrane's Chileans stormed in with them too. In a confusing, I would have to say, dispiriting night for the Spanish, one by one of all the forts on the western side of the port were abandoned or captured in this chaotic fashion. As he gathered his forces to attack the rest of the forts, he had his flagship sail in, and of course the Spanish thought that this ship must be packed to the gunwales with reinforcements. And of course then the remaining defenders fled, and as they fled, they looted their own town. And of course they also abandoned vast piles of military supplies. Now, far from carrying reinforcements, Cochrane's flagship only had a skeleton crew aboard, and it was leaking so badly they actually had to run her straight into a mudflat to stop her sinking. But you know what? Cochrane had done it. There was jubilation in Santiago with the news. Cochrane's pay was immediately doubled. He was given a great Chilean estate. But you know, Old habits die hard, even in South America, and Cochrane chose to see enemies everywhere. He started picking fights with Chilean politicians. He was a difficult but brilliant man, let's face it. Meanwhile, in a remarkable subplot, a Spanish agent had actually attempted to kill Cochrane's wife. He'd actually broken into his house and wounded her with a knife, but was eventually overwhelmed in the struggle. Hungry for more success, he now headed back north into that stubborn Spanish headquarters of Callao, and he came up with a typically audacious plan. He wanted to capture, the Navy call it to cut out, the flagship of the Spanish Empire's fleet in the Americas, the Esmeralda, and she was a 44-gun frigate, and she was anchored behind a floating barrier or a boom under the guns of recently reinforced fortress, mounting some 300 cannons. 300 cannons! And it had no fewer than 27 gunboats protecting her. Cochrane then made his customary reconnaissance, rowing around in a small boat taking depth of the water, checking the range of the guns, the elevation, the fields of fire, and familiarizing himself with every detail of the harbor. And of course, as he did so, the Spanish were firing shots and shell at him. He was drenched. His little boat was rocked by detonations, the explosions, the impact of these cannonballs and shells beside him and his little boat. But it didn't deter him. And he then returned to his flagship and asked for volunteers for an incredibly dangerous mission. Every single sailor and marine on his 3 ships immediately volunteered. This is how much they believed in Cochrane. This is how much they loved Cochrane. In preparation for the attack, Cochrane sent 2 of his ships out to sea, making the Spanish think that they'd actually gone offshore looking for some prey, looking for some Spanish ships to capture, hoping they'd be put at ease. But at 11 p.m., in the dark of the night, Cochrane's men took to their boats. They muffled their oars with rags so that there was no squeaking wood on wood, and they arrived at the floating boom where they were challenged by a guard boat. Cochrane's men responded by threatening to kill every single man on board. They stayed quiet. Cochrane's crew pulled alongside the frigate, the Esmeralda, and clambered up the sides. Most of the Spaniards were asleep. One sentry, though, hit Cochrane with the butt of his musket, and he fell back onto a protruding piece of wood that punctured into his back and out through his shoulder. He was then shot in the thigh, but staggered aboard to continue the attack. It was all over in 15 minutes. Cochrane and his men had control of the Esmeralda. During his scouting, Cochrane also noticed that the other ships in the harbor hoisted distinctive lanterns into their rigging to identify themselves as Spaniards to their comrades in the forts above. Cochrane now ordered these lanterns to be raised on the Esmeralda, so the gunners above actually ceased firing, thinking the Spanish must still be in control of the flagship as they raised the correct signal lanterns. Cochrane was weak from his injuries, and he then ordered the Esmeralda's topsail to be shaken out, and they quietly ghosted out of the harbor on a gentle breeze. This was a spectacular coup, the capture of the Spanish flagship, and of course this then left Cochrane as undisputed commander on the Pacific coast. The Spanish had now absolutely no chance of reasserting themselves in South America. The garrisons would wither on the vine, cut off from their supplies, unable to support each other, and one by one they simply surrendered. In July of 1822, Lima, the capital of Peru, fell to the independent forces. Cochrane entered the city in a chariot drawn by 4 horses. I can only imagine. Can you imagine the spectacle? The poet Lord Byron, when he received news of this back in Britain, was so jealous that he couldn't really cope. And he said, "There is no man I envy as much." In the spring of 1820, Callao's anchorage would have been crowded. This was the most important Spanish naval base on the Pacific. All of the gold of the Incas came down on mule trains from the Andes and were loaded into galleons here in Callao. And it therefore attracted the attention of some of Britain's greatest sailors and marauders over the centuries, including the likes of Sir Francis Drake. It was from here that the Spanish were actually able to exercise naval supremacy over the entirety of the Pacific coast of South America, a naval supremacy that Cochrane knew, the Chileans knew, had to be snatched away from them if these new nations Chile and Peru would have any chance of lasting independence. And it was as audacious as we've come to expect from Cochrane. Chile was independent, Peru was independent, Cochrane was a hero, but obviously he'd fallen out with his political masters and he left the service of the Chilean Navy in November 1822. Interestingly, 5 Chilean naval ships have since been named after him. That's how much, even to this day, they revere him. And of course, he'd won back a bit of his reputation, and he'd firmed up his financial position, and there were other nascent countries in the market for his talents. In March 1822, the Brazilian War of Independence against Portugal had just begun. Brazil had got a taste of being master of its own fate during the Napoleonic Wars, when the Portuguese court had evacuated Portugal and been based there. At the end of the war, the Portuguese went back to Europe. Well, most of them. The king's son, Prince Pedro, who had actually spent his formative years in Brazil, actually stayed behind and was, let's just say he was persuaded to declare independence, to break away from his father's empire. Cochrane was offered the job of commander-in-chief of the new Brazilian Navy, and he was interested. The Chileans at this stage had won their battles, really with no prospect of action. They'd also run out of money to fund their navy, which is often the case, which is often the aftermath, of victorious revolutions. And there was also a hint of civil war in the offing, and coincidentally, a giant earthquake had just destroyed Cochrane's house. So there's 3 fairly strong reasons to up sticks and leave Chile. So he negotiated hard with the Brazilians. He forced them to create a special rank for him so that he was now superior to everybody else in the Brazilian Navy, and he named a very, very steep price for his services. But you know what? He actually knew his worth, so why not? Within a day of arriving in Brazil, he'd met Pedro. He'd reviewed his fleet, and he had a battleship of 64 guns, the Pedro I. He also had 3 frigates, 2 smaller corvettes, 3 little brigs, and even, a plethora of smaller ships at his disposal. And of course, within 2 weeks, he was at sea. The Portuguese, for their part, sailed out of San Salvador with 11 warships, and the 2 forces met on the 4th of May. Cochrane, like Nelson before him, just went straight at them. But he very quickly discovered that his crew's gunnery was absolutely awful. They couldn't hit a single thing. He also believed that there were Portuguese sailors on board his ship that were deliberately sabotaging the ship's efforts. So he had no option but to retreat. But he then came up with a classic Cochrane plan. The Portuguese fleet had San Salvador as its safe haven. So of course, what did Cochrane decide to do? Well, if you've been paying any attention at all to any of these 3 episodes, you'll know exactly what he's about to do before I tell you. He decides to go straight at it. He combed through his entire fleet. He got all of his most reliable crewmen into 3 ships, and he started blockading the port of San Salvador. The defenders began to grow hungry and to grow desperate. Cochrane then pushed his luck. He decided on a display of strength. He sailed his ship straight into the harbor while the Portuguese top brass were busy at a ball, and in the end, this was actually enough. The people of San Salvador were so terrified by the prospect of an attack by the world's most famous sailor that they simply forced the Portuguese governor to order the abandonment of the city. How incredible. In early July, 17 warships and 75 transport ships carrying the loyal Portuguese and their most precious possessions sailed out of San Salvador as the flag of an independent Brazil was raised behind them. These Portuguese ships then sailed into hell. They were spread out, they were demoralized, they were loaded down with possessions of an evacuating army, and they were now prey for the sea wolf. Cochrane attacked where and when it suited him. After a week of running battles, he'd managed to capture 16 ships and 2,000 men. Cochrane then had to return to Brazil to repair his ship, but one of his subordinates kept up the attacks all the way through to the mouth of the Tagus River in Portugal itself, with Lisbon in sight. Cochrane himself then sailed north. He sailed straight into San Luis, an important port, And this time he had British colours, a British flag, flying from his flagstaff. He decided to anchor up close to the shore, and when local dignitaries came out to wish him well, he arrested them all. He then sent a proclamation ashore stating that a mighty fleet was on the way to liberate the region by force. And of course, there was no mighty fleet on the way at all. It was a ruse. But the citizens, however, they didn't want to see running battles on the streets, their houses used as strongholds, and half-drunk sailors with rum and adrenaline coursing through their veins abusing their women. They surrendered the town immediately. Cochrane then stripped the town in a way that would put Francis Drake to shame. The treasury was emptied, every ship captured, that's some 30 vessels in all. He then confiscated the property of any Portuguese person that he found there, and he sent any trade goods in warehouses back to Rio de Janeiro. He then played the same trick against a province in the north, just sending in a ship telling them to surrender, telling them that a much bigger fleet was imminent. And like another domino, the provinces fell to Cochrane's demands, agreeing to support an independent Brazil. In less than 4 months, he had liberated the capitals of 3 provinces, a vast territory stretching back over 2,000 miles of coastline. Cochrane then arrived back in Rio de Janeiro a hero. In typical Cochrane fashion, you know what's coming next. He then spent the next few months falling out with everyone and fighting about prize money. The grind of all that, plus the obvious descent of Brazil into civil strife, I would say, caused him to jump in a Brazilian naval ship and sail to England, pretending he'd been caught by contrary winds. On June the 26th, 1825, he arrived in the Solent. The legality of the situation was extremely unclear. Cochrane, though, didn't care. He barreled in with a massive Brazilian ensign on the stern, his pendant of an admiral at the masthead. He fired a salute towards HMS Victory, and the naval commander replied in kind. And this is the first time any European state had ever accorded sovereign status to the flag of New Brazil. Isn't that astounding? Cochrane then spent a few months in Britain acquiring properties, but he was then wooed once again. Another would-be nation wanted to enlist the mighty Cochrane to help secure their freedom. This time it was the Greeks. They lobbied him to help come liberate them from the Ottoman Turkish rule. The Ottomans at this stage were using the Acropolis as a magazine, a powder magazine storage area, and the Turks were supplying their strongholds here in Greece by sea, and Cochrane knew it. Cochrane was a man in demand, and he demanded a vast amount of money to go in and to help. And he also demanded a fleet of cutting-edge steamships. The Greeks accepted his terms, and he arrived in March in 1827. And his first task was actually attempting to relieve a Greek force that had been besieged by the Turks on top of the Acropolis. A very brave group of Greek patriots had seized the Acropolis, and they were now being besieged, and his job was to try and relieve them. Cochrane then sailed into Piraeus, a giant ensign flying from the stern of his ship. And it was his own design because the Greeks didn't really have a flag at that point, and what he decided to use was the Owl of Athena. I actually think it's a shame that the Greeks didn't actually pick up on that one and run with it, because it was an amazing ensign. Anyway, from the shore he then blasted a Turkish position, a Turkish strong point in a monastery, and of course they soon surrendered. Cochrane had yet another victory, but it would be his last. Meanwhile, the British, Russian, and French navies had tried to secure an armistice between the Greeks and the Turks. And the navies of the British and the Russians and the French had actually fought and won. They'd drawn up beside the Turkish-Egyptian fleet to begin talks. Unexpectedly, there was an explosion that actually set off a more general engagement between these navies. And soon there was an absolutely terrible exchange of gunnery. And after a few hours of non-stop fighting in the Bay of Navarino off the coast of Greece, there was nothing left but a shattered mass of hulks and spars and rigging. And effectively, the combined navies of the British, the Russians, and the French fought and won the last major battle in the Age of Sail. Of course, no one was to know that, but it was a very significant battle. 50 Turkish Egyptian ships had been sunk. And of course, Greek independence was now just a matter of time, and there was little more that Cochrane could do really to hasten it. So he returned to Britain. He returned to a life of invention, of advocacy, and more importantly, of family. He also wanted full readmittance into society, but he would have to wait for two key enemies to pass. King George IV, who'd been Prince Regent, he died in 1830, and he was succeeded by his little brother, who became William IV, who'd actually served in the Navy, who was a great admirer of Cochrane. In politics, the Duke of Wellington and the Tories also left office, making way for the Whigs, then more aligned to Cochrane's politics. And in July 1831, Cochrane's poverty-stricken father had also died at aged 83, and Cochrane finally became the 10th Earl of Dundonald. Finally, on the 2nd of May 1832, as Britain was racked with violence and upheavals, and the campaign for parliamentary reform was taking place, it was decided at a Privy Council meeting that a full pardon would be issued to Cochrane, and that he would be reinstated into the Royal Navy. This part actually gives me goosebumps of the story, because finally there's redemption for this incredible man. He was now a Rear Admiral in His Britannic Majesty's Navy. But in true Cochrane style, he refused to serve in a posting until his knighthood was restored to him, and he would have to wait a little while for that. Finally, a new monarch, the young Queen Victoria, announced that she would give him the next vacant slot for the Knight of the Bath. And then, in one final happy chapter, Cochrane finally raised his admiral's flag on a Royal Naval ship of the line at sea, and he served as Commander-in-Chief of the North American West Indies Station from 1848 to 1851. He was a Vice Admiral, that was Nelson's rank, and his son was serving alongside him as a lieutenant. His admiral's pennant was finally hauled down from the mast in Portsmouth when he was 75 years old, and he left his last British ship as a serving officer. Weirdly, he was actually considered for a command in the Baltic during the Crimean War, but it was decided that even as an ancient man at that stage, there was too much high risk of a chance that he would do a daring attack, and he was not given the job. He died eventually in 1860 during an operation to remove kidney stones. He's buried in Westminster Abbey, and every year a delegation from the Chilean Navy hold a wreath-laying ceremony at his grave, even to this day. So passed one of Britain's greatest sailors. His audacity, his leadership, the love of his followers, his companions, I think makes him one of the most alluring, one of the most fascinating, I have to say, one of the most inspiring figures in British naval history. As is, I have to say, his commitment in his reforming zeal. He is taking principled stands against slavery, against a restricted franchise that puts him very much on the right side of history. This was an incredible man. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure for me to tell you this man's story. I hope you've enjoyed the 3 episodes, and I look forward to coming back to you next week with something just as exciting. It's been an absolute pleasure writing and making this series. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.